Now, often forgotten in the study of the Reconstruction period is the black participation in Reconstruction. African Americans, many of them former Union soldiers, came south and became the first black men elected to local, statewide, and national office, including the first African American who became governor of a U.S. state. Now you see here in the artwork from the Center for Louisiana Studies, an African American legislator making a salient point to a multicultural, diverse body of legislators who are paying rapt attention to him. Obviously, this is a picture that is pro-African American and therefore inclined to show what the African American could do in the legislature. Unfortunately, there were also many other depictions of African Americans in the legislatures that were, shall we say, less than flattering. Later lionized by D.W. Griffith's Birth of a Nation when he made that film in 1915. In the presidential election of 1868, Andrew Johnson had been neutralized. He was not going to get the Republican nomination, being as he was not a Republican, and because of the fact that he was so staunchly opposed to the radicals in Congress. So the president basically went home to Tennessee. Meanwhile, the Republicans met in Chicago and chose a man who had never held elective office in his life. Ulysses S. Grant was the war hero whom many believed would carry on the work of the radicals in Congress and tended to identify with the radicals in Congress. The Democrats that year met at Tammany Hall, the famous hall, the New York political machine in New York City, and their slogan was, "This is a white man's country, let the white men rule." After numerous ballots, including several with Andrew Johnson on it, former Governor Horatio Seymour of New York was chosen, despite his initial reluctance to accept the nomination. In the first election where African Americans could vote, the racial tone of the campaign was vicious and tinged with accusations of miscegenation by the Democrats against the Republicans, while Grant said nothing himself during the campaign other than, "Let us have peace." Seymour actually tried to tone down the stridency of the Democrats, but Grant won 26 states and 53% of the popular vote, which again shows that 47% of the American population did not want civil rights for African Americans, did not want voting rights for African Americans, and wanted to continue with segregation. Now, the Grant administration was not as dynamic as the radicals would have hoped, because Grant saw himself more as a caretaker president. But Congress, still dominated by the radicals, continued forward with the redefinition of voting rights, in which it facilitated a shift in the protection of voting rights from the states, which they felt unreliable in this regard, to the federal government. And to do this, Congress created and Grant signed into law a new section of the Cabinet, the Department of Justice. Congress also passed and sent to the states for ratification the 15th Amendment, which prohibited disenfranchisement based on race. However, this was a very, very vague amendment when it came to gender, nor did it prohibit things like literacy tests and poll taxes. Nonetheless, the 15th Amendment did pass. Congress continued on its progressive activist path. The Enforcement Acts of 1870-71, also known as the Kkk Acts of 1870, now begin to enforce the 14th and 15th Amendment and called for federal intervention to protect people's voting rights. The president now had the power for the first time to both suppress state disorders on his own initiative and to suspend the right of habeas corpus. Now, Grant did not hesitate to use this authority on numerous occasions during his presidency, and as a result, the Ku Klux Klan was completely dismantled, ending the first Klan era, and did not resurface again in any meaningful way until the beginning of the 20th century, and then it resurfaced up in the North. Congress drove on. In 1875, they passed the Civil Rights Act, which was promoted by Senator Charles Sumner, who believed that the 15th Amendment did not go far enough. The law actually passed after Sumner died in 1874. The last federal civil rights law enacted until 1957, the Civil Rights Act of 1875, prohibited racial discrimination in the selection of juries and in public accommodations. The radicals went on. They began to build a base of support throughout the former Confederacy. This leads to the growth of the Republican Party in the South, which consisted of mostly free men of color and former slaves. Also, you had carpetbaggers who came from the North. We'll get to them in a little bit. It also included disaffected Southern whites, that is, small farmers who felt left out of the system and felt that whiteness was not nearly enough for them to invest in the Democratic Party. The major planks of the Republican Party in the South were suffrage for African Americans and putting African Americans into political office along with Republican whites. Because of these policies and the fact that numerous Southern Democrats were disenfranchised ex-Confederates, African Americans made major gains throughout the South. They were putting men into office who had been former Union soldiers or federal employees from the North, including teachers and agents of the Freedmen's Bureau. They were elected to local office like sheriffs and justices of the peace. They were elected to state legislatures. They held national office. They held congressional seats. Hiram Revels was elected to the United States Senate from Mississippi, and even eventually the governor of Louisiana, because PBS Pinchback, Pinckney Benton Stewart Pinchback, whom you see in the photograph there, became the first African-American state governor. He was not elected, however. He ascended to the governorship when the previous governor was impeached, and he was the governor of Louisiana for all of 35 days. Nonetheless, he was the first. It would not be until the 1980s when Douglas Wilder would be elected the first black governor of a state when he was elected governor of Virginia. This is a composite of the African Americans in the Louisiana Reconstruction government. It must be understood that at no time did African Americans ever comprise the majority in state legislatures. White Republicans and Democrats who took an oath of loyalty to the Union dominated the legislatures. The large picture in the center is that of Oscar K. Dunn. Oscar K. Dunn was the first elected lieutenant governor of a state in Louisiana. He would have become governor except for the fact that he passed away, and that put PBS Pinchback in as lieutenant governor, and then he became governor. But now let's get back to the carpetbaggers. Who were these carpetbaggers? Carpetbaggers were Northern Republicans who came south after the Civil War. These were men on the make, probably shut out of office in the northern states. They saw opportunities to achieve office and make money in the South. They were called carpetbaggers because so many of them brought their belongings in suitcases made from pieces of scrap carpet. Men such as Adelbert Ames, who came to Mississippi, were idealists. They saw an opportunity to make the political situation better. He was the son-in-law of Benjamin F. Butler, who became notorious in New Orleans during the Union occupation, nicknamed Spoon's Butler. Ames attempted to shift Mississippi politics towards more African Americans in office. He had to contend with serious violence against his program during this time. Now others, like Henry Clay Warmuth, who came to Louisiana, were corrupt from head to toe and as racist as any Southern Democrat. Henry Clay Warmuth was one of the youngest governors ever elected in United States history. He became governor of Louisiana at the age of 26. Warmuth weakened civil rights protection. He endorsed a fusion ticket that included Democrats on it, and when he tried to tinker with the election in 1872, he would be impeached and then replaced by Pinchback. Now, in addition to carpetbaggers who came from the North, scalawags were white Southerners who supported Reconstruction policies and efforts. The term scalawag is a pejorative. It refers to farm animals that are useless. Now, scalawags were Unionists and Republicans in the South, remnants of the old Whig Party. And they came from the middle classes, merchants, artisans, professionals. They also drew from small farmers who were disaffected. One of their leading members was James L. Alcorn of Mississippi, the man after whom Alcorn State University is named. Now, Alcorn, despite being a Republican like Albert Ames, fought consistently with Albert Ames for control of the Republican Party during Reconstruction. Now, of course, Reconstruction policies engendered a great deal of white backlash. The Ku Klux Klan, or the Invisible Empire, operated in the countryside, and its members operated in secret. Their white robes and burning crosses were corruptions of an ancient white-robed Celtic tradition in which the priests of Ireland would summon their followers with great fires on the top of hills. Eventually, after Christianity came to the Celts, the great fires now took the shape of crosses. The Knights of the White Camellia was a Louisiana Klan-style organization founded by a Confederate Army colonel named Alcibiades de Blanc on May 22, 1867 in Franklin, Louisiana. The members of the White Camellia were pledged to support the supremacy of the white race, to oppose the amalgamation of the races, to resist the social and political encroachment of the so-called carpetbaggers, and to restore white control of the government. The Knights were a leading terrorist organization in Louisiana. Their tactics included harassment, floggings, sometimes murder, and they produced a reign of terror among the state's black population during the summer and fall of 1868. The Knights of the White Camellia consisted mainly of upper-class Southerners, including physicians, landowners, newspaper editors, doctors, and officers. And their masks was often done to, shall we say, avoid being recognized when they did what they did. Now, eventually, the more aggressive members of this organization would join the White Leagues, which were unlike the Klan or the Camellias in that they operated openly and in communities like cities. You had other organizations like the Red Shirts that operated in Mississippi. This was a paramilitary organization. Their uniform was a red shirt with 2 white stripes on the shoulders. That was the uniform for a long time of the Ole Miss Rebels football team, which is one of the reasons why they have gone away from the red shirt. In the bottom left, Albert Ames went on to become governor and then U.S. Senator from Mississippi. After Reconstruction, he would leave Mississippi and move to Minnesota and to Michigan, and there he would help found General Mills, which is a cereal company that produces cereals like Lucky Charms. In the middle is James L. Alcorn, Ames's bitter rival, who had been a Confederate before becoming a Republican. On the far right is Henry Clay Warmuth in a much later photograph when he was a sugar planter living in Chalmette, Louisiana throughout the rest of his life. He became governor and then resigned when impeached, giving way to Pinchback. The violence of the Klan, the White Leagues, and the Camellias took a number of leading proponents of Reconstruction policies. George W. Ashburn was assassinated for his pro-black sentiments in Columbus, Georgia. General George Gordon Meade, who was the military governor of Georgia, who had been the commanding general at the Battle of Gettysburg, arrested 21 men, but was convinced to let them go so that Georgia would ratify the 14th Amendment. Not a single one of the men who murdered George Ashburn was ever brought to trial. The White League murdered Julie Hayden, the young woman you see in the upper left-hand corner. She was a 17-year-old school teacher from Tennessee. and the White League murdered her in 1874. The Thomas Nast cartoon at the bottom depicts a sword-wielding Columbia, representing the United States, protecting an injured black man from being beaten by a mob of White Leaguers. In the upper right-hand corner is Nathan Bedford Forrest, known to all who knew him as Bedford Forrest. He was the infamous Confederate cavalry commander. He is, of course, the man on whom Forrest Gump was named. Bedford Forrest founded the Ku Klux Klan, became its first imperial wizard. But then he left the Klan when it became too violent. And if Nathan Bedford Forrest thinks that you're too violent, you're too violent. One of the long-running canards about Reconstruction is that it was rife with corruption. There was some corruption. This was a large government program, the Freedmen's Bureau and other programs designed to bring money and progress to the South. But much good was done. Louisiana, Mississippi, and Alabama all rewrote their constitutions in 1868, approving the 14th Amendment. As a result, they were admitted to the Union. Henry Clay Warmuth was corrupt, but he was impeached by the legislature. He was removed as governor of Louisiana. You had schools, theaters, and public places were integrated. African Americans, now striving for literacy, founded their own newspaper, the New Orleans Tribune, for example. You had returning boards that were designed to make sure that no skullduggery would happen during elections. You had a property tax increase on white landowners. This meant that schools and public facilities could either be built or improved. Now, on the negative side, the first Louisiana lottery was chartered in 1868, and this became a serious vehicle for corruption and political shenanigans throughout Louisiana. The first president of the lottery was Pierre Gustave Touton Beauregard of Louisiana, of St. Bernard Parish. He was above reproach, but many of those in the Louisiana lottery were rapacious, to say the least. Nonetheless, despite all that, the effects of Reconstruction overall were positive. You had public schools built. Black higher education began. In addition, African American religious congregations like the African Methodist Episcopal congregation in Charleston, South Carolina, which was the scene of that terrible massacre back in 2015. Other places like that begin to grow. The wage labor system grew as workers for a time controlled the selling of their work. However, for most former slaves, what they had was freedom and nothing else. Thus, sharecropping became the chief economic labor system. In sharecropping, the former slaves agreed to live on and work the land for a planter in exchange for a share of the crops. Now, on paper, this tenant farming system seems equitable. However, below the surface lurk numerous problems. Rather than base the tenancy on the market of the crop, usually cotton or sugar in Louisiana, the rents were fixed. This meant that if the market price of the crop fell, the sharecropper now falls behind. As a result, sharecroppers would mortgage future crops hoping for a better yield in future years. But what usually happened was a never-ending cycle of poverty. That was but one step up from slavery. Nonetheless, most African Americans and a large number of whites chose sharecropping, because at least it gave them some semblance of agency over their circumstances. They worked when they wanted to work, not when an overseer or a boss told them to do so. This is the economic system that exists, however, throughout the South, all the way up until the time of the Great Depression, and even beyond that.